you see there's 4 guys, linked arms, sitting there in the water. The helicopter was getting kind of low on fuel and pretty full. We were pretty near our max weight limit. It's a small helicopter. And we figured, well, we got to do something for these guys. And so as an air crew, we make the decision to leave me on scene with a raft. And without me, they can take one more guy, and then I can help those guys get into the raft so they can live long enough for whatever ship or helicopter is going to come back next.
2 nights before the ship sinks, an engineer stands on the deck and argues that something on board is going to get people killed. He loses the argument. What he warned about is a stack of fishing net and where it's piled. 48 hours later, in the middle of the Bering Sea, that exact pile of net is the reason he can't stop the sea from pouring into the engine room. Of the 47 people aboard the Alaska Ranger, 5 will die that night. And after 10 years, we'll finally see the man who saw the problem early come forward and speak up. In the meantime, 2 separate federal investigations will try and explain why the ship went down. They agree it shouldn't have happened, but they will split on the question that matters most. What opened the ship to the sea? This is the sinking of the Alaska Ranger. To understand how 47 people end up in that water, you have to go back 2 nights to a dock in Dutch Harbor, Alaska. Tied up at the pier is the Alaska Ranger, 189 feet of steel, owned by a Seattle company called the Fishing Company of Alaska. She is what the industry calls a head and guts boat, a floating factory that catches fish, cleans them, and freezes them right there on board. That is why there are so many people aboard for a fishing trip. Most of them are not fishermen. They are processors working the factory line below deck. The plan is simple. They'll go about 500 miles out to Petrel Bank and fill the holds with Atka mackerel. On the evening of March 21, 2008, Assistant Engineer Rodney Lundy is walking the deck when he sees something he does not like. Crew have stacked bundles of fishing net around 2 air vents, the vents that feed air down into the engine room. To Lundy, the danger is obvious. If the main deck ever floods, those vents need to be closed fast. If they stay open, the sea has a straight path into the engine room. Buried under a pile of netting, they cannot be shut in a hurry. Remember Rodney Lundy. And remember those vents. On most boats, that should be a simple safety argument. On the Alaska Ranger, it was not. That's because the Alaska Ranger does not have one boss. She has 2. There is the captain, an American in command of the vessel. But there is also a second authority aboard, a fishmaster named Satoshi Kono, who leads a small group of Japanese crewmen and has real power over how the fishing gets done. 2 chains of command are running side by side on the same boat. When Lundy pushes the issue about the netting, he pushes it with Kono. Lundy says it is a safety problem. Kono refuses to move the gear. Lundy loses the argument and the netting stays where it is. The next day, March 22nd, the Alaska Ranger casts off from Dutch Harbor and points her bow toward Petrel Bank. There are 47 people aboard. In command is Captain Eric Jacobson, known as Pete to the people who know him, a veteran skipper who has worked this brutal stretch of ocean for years. The departure is routine. By the standards of the Bering Sea in March, the weather is not extraordinary. And that ocean sets a high bar for extraordinary. Freezing air, freezing spray, and seas that build fast and hit hard. With a coastline so remote that help is measured in hours of flight time, not minutes. At this point, the Alaska Ranger has about a day and a half left. At around 2:30 a.m. on March 23rd, water is discovered in the rudder room, the compartment at the very back of the ship, wrapped around the steering gear. Here is the first thing to understand. The rudder room flooding should have been survivable. To understand why, you have to understand the boat's past. The Alaska Ranger was not built to be a fishing boat. She was built in 1973 to service oil fields. In 1988, she was converted and rebuilt to catch and process fish. That conversion changed the ship in a way that almost nobody thought about for the next 20 years. The rudders pass up through the bottom of the hull inside steel tubes called rudder trunks. Each trunk is a 9-inch opening into the sea. When the ship was originally designed, those openings sat above the waterline. If water found its way into a rudder trunk, it had nowhere dangerous to go. But the conversion added weight. It pushed the whole ship about 2.5 feet deeper into the water. After 1988, those 9-inch openings no longer sat above the waterline. They sat below it. And the deck above the rudder room, the only thing separating that compartment from the rest of the ship, sat just 20 inches above those openings. That means that if the rudder room fills, the Alaska Ranger is now fighting the sea from inside the hull. And at 2:30 in the morning, that is exactly what begins. Rodney Lundy heads aft toward the rudder room. The same engineer who warned about the blocked vents is now trying to keep the first flood contained. When he gets there, a wall of water is already coming at him. He muscles the watertight door shut. Then he grabs a sledgehammer and beats on a pipe wrench to crank the door's locking dogs down tighter, trying to seal it against the pressure. For a moment, it seems it might be working. Then the ship loses electrical power, and the Alaska Ranger does something a sinking ship is not supposed to do. She starts driving herself backward. When this ship was rebuilt, the propulsion system was redesigned. The propeller blades can change pitch, which means they can be angled to push the ship forward or pull it astern. When the power dies, the hydraulics that hold those blades in place lose pressure. The blades default to an astern pitch. In layman's terms, reverse. With no one at the controls, the Alaska Ranger begins backing herself down into the sea, stern first, dragging her flooded tail deeper and into the water, accelerating the flooding. This is the second detail to hold on to. The Alaska Ranger is no longer just taking on water. She is pulling herself deeper into it. The stern drops. The sea climbs onto the main deck. And now the warning from Dutch Harbor comes back. Lundy goes for the air vents, trying to cover them before water can find its way below. He gets one closed, but the second vent, the starboard vent, is buried under the bundles of net. The same gear he argued about 2 nights earlier is now in his way, and he cannot get it covered in time. Water pours down the open vent and into the engine room. The ship lurches into a hard list to starboard. Up on the bridge, that list is the moment Captain Jacobson gives the order no skipper ever wants to give. Abandon ship. The order goes out, and the ship comes alive all at once. Most of the 47 people aboard are processors, not deckhands. They came aboard to run a factory line. Now they are being told to put on survival suits in the middle of the night as the deck tilts under their feet. The suits are full neoprene shells that seal a person from head to foot. Getting into one quickly is hard in good conditions. Doing it in the dark on a listing ship with water moving through the vessel below you is something else entirely. The water is just above freezing that night, and the air is even colder. 47 people now have to get off this ship before she goes under. But the backward motion creates another problem. The life rafts are supposed to launch and stay close enough for the crew to climb aboard. But the Alaska Ranger is still moving astern. As she backs through the water, the rafts swing wide and drag away from the men trying to reach them. Some crew make it to a raft, but most of them do not. They go straight into the Bering Sea, scattered across the swells in suits built to buy them time, not save them forever. Less than half of the 47 make it into a life raft. For everyone else, survival comes down to the suit and the clock. The men who could not reach a raft are floating alone across a black, heaving ocean, lifted and dropped by 20-foot seas, with no way to know whether anyone has their exact position. The distress call goes out, and the response is massive. A Coast Guard HH-60 Jayhawk launches out of Air Station Kodiak and flies toward the ship's position. It is a long, punishing flight through weather that makes a helicopter feel very small. The Coast Guard cutter Monroe is already steaming hard for the scene, and it puts its own smaller HH-65 Dolphin into the air. The Alaska Ranger's sister ship, the Alaska Warrior, is fishing nearby and races over to start hauling people out of the rafts and out of the water. What you are about to see is the actual rescue footage from the Alaska Ranger. And what follows is hours of brutal and methodical rescue work. Every person has to be found first. One head in a survival suit, somewhere in a black ocean, located by a strobe, a flashlight, or a brief glimpse between waves.
I did not expect to see what we saw. Many survivors stretched out over a great distance. I expected survivors in the raft, and I expected survivors linked up, arm to arm, and just in a fairly tight group. It's not what we came up on.
Then a rescue swimmer goes down into water just above freezing. The basket comes down. A survivor goes up. Then the basket comes down again, over and over. The helicopter crews work hoist after hoist. 20 people are lifted straight out of the sea and set down on the deck of the Monroe. Others are pulled aboard the Alaska Warrior. One at a time, in conditions dangerous enough to kill the rescuers too, the survivors come out of the water. For the men in the rafts and the men still in the sea, the weight stretches across the rest of the night. They are not pulled out all at once. They are pulled out when they can be found and reached, while the cold keeps working and the clock keeps moving. By the time it is over, the Coast Guard will describe it as the largest cold water rescue in its history. But one detail from that operation will send chills down your back.
We see there's 4 guys, linked arms, sitting there in the water. The helicopter was getting kind of low on fuel and pretty full. We were pretty near our max weight limit. It's a small helicopter. And we figured, well, we got to do something for these guys. And so as an air crew, we make the decision to leave me on scene with a raft. And without me, they can take one more guy, and then I can help those guys get into the raft so they can live long enough for whatever ship or helicopter is going to come back next.
While the entire rescue was undoubtedly heroic, one aspect of it had fatal consequences. At one point, the Coast Guard is given the wrong count of how many people were aboard the ship. Working from that bad number, the searchers believe they have accounted for everyone. They stand down the search. But the number is wrong and there is still a man out there. When the mistake is caught, the Coast Guard turns around and starts searching again. They go back over that black water and look for him. They never find him. When it is finally over, the tally is this. Of the 47 people aboard the Alaska Ranger, 42 are rescued alive. 5 are lost. And the 5 who die are not random. They are mostly the ship's leadership, the captain, the mate, the chief engineer, and the fishmaster, Satoshi Kono. The men running the boat went down with her. This will matter later because some of the people who could answer the hardest questions are gone. 42 people survive a sinking in the Bering Sea in the middle of a March night. The rescue is extraordinary, but it does not answer the question everyone is about to ask. Why did the Alaska Ranger sink at all? 2 federal bodies go looking for the answer. The National Transportation Safety Board sends investigators to determine a probable cause. The Coast Guard convenes a Marine Board of Investigation, which can put witnesses under oath and compel testimony. And the investigation begins with a strange fact. The Alaska Ranger should not have sunk. According to the stability analysis, if the flooding had stayed inside the rudder room, the Alaska Ranger should have remained afloat. That compartment was supposed to trap the water and give the ship a chance. The water was never supposed to leave that room, but it left anyway. It left because the inside of the ship was not watertight the way it was supposed to be. Witnesses testified that watertight doors were poorly maintained and were routinely left open. Holes had been cut through bulkheads to run refrigeration lines for the fish factory. The internal walls that were supposed to trap the flooding and save the ship were, in practice, full of openings. So the water that entered the stern did not stay in the stern. It moved forward, compartment by compartment, into the engine room and beyond. On that point, both agencies agree. And this is where the story changes. Because if the Alaska Ranger went down because of one sudden mechanical failure, that is one kind of tragedy. If she went down because known weaknesses, open pathways, poor maintenance, and ignored warnings lined up at the same time, that is another. The Coast Guard hearings run for weeks. Survivors testify under oath about what they saw. Engineers and company officials are questioned about how the ship was maintained. Naval architects walk through how she was supposed to float and why she did not. Line by line, people reconstruct the worst night of their lives in a conference room so the world can finally understand it. But the most important question never gets a clean answer. How did the water get in first? Or more simply, was the rudder gone? The NTSB lands here. Yes, probably. Investigators conclude that one of the ship's rudders physically fell out of the boat. If that happened, it would have left the 9-inch rudder trunk wide open to the sea, the same opening the 1988 conversion had lowered below the waterline. Water climbs up through the hole, fills the rudder room, and the disaster begins. To the NTSB, the smoking gun is a design flaw that nobody ever fixed. The Coast Guard lands somewhere else. Its investigators conclude that the rudder probably stayed in place. In their reading, the hull was breached somewhere in the stern, most likely around the struts that support the quart nozzles, the steel shrouds around the propellers. They find evidence that those struts had cracked and been patched, then cracked and been patched again. They find structural failures in the aft ballast tanks and potable water tanks that had gone unaddressed. Their conclusion is blunt. The Fishing Company of Alaska failed to properly maintain the structural condition of the ship, and the sea finally found its way in through steel that should have been repaired years earlier. So the case is left with two answers: a lost rudder or a failing hull. Same ship, same sinking, two official explanations. And there is one object that could break the tie: the wreck itself. If investigators could put a camera on the stern of the Alaska Ranger and see whether the rudder is still attached, the argument would be over in seconds. But the Alaska Ranger is lying in roughly 6,000 feet of water. For practical purposes, she is unreachable. No one has examined the wreck. So the central question of the case, what actually opened the hull, has never been settled, and it almost certainly never will be. The investigations also turn up other findings that are hard to read. All three of the ship's engineers were under-licensed for the jobs they were holding on that voyage. The company had no written training program. It had no written emergency procedures. It leaned on captains and officers to figure things out as they went. And while the Alaska Ranger was enrolled in a voluntary Coast Guard program meant to hold older fishing boats to a higher safety standard, she had not met all of its requirements by the time she sank. These details do not tell you exactly what opened the hull. They tell you what kind of system the ship was operating inside. Part of how a 35-year-old converted oil field service boat ends up in that condition is the rule book itself. At the time, many commercial fishing vessels were exempt from the routine Coast Guard inspections that other ships had to pass. They were held to a minimum of safety gear, but not the same level of structural oversight. A boat like the Alaska Ranger could go years without anyone outside the company climbing down into the stern and looking hard at the steel. That steel is exactly what both investigations would later argue about. Captain Jacobson's daughter, Karen, offers another possibility at the hearings. She says that on a run before her father took command, the ship may have struck ice and damaged the rudder. A hidden wound, unseen and waiting. It is only a theory. She says that herself. Nobody knows for sure. That is where the official story ends. But for Rodney Lundy, it was his time to tell the truth. 10 years later, in 2018, Lundy decides he cannot stay quiet anymore. He is the assistant engineer who fought to seal the rudder room door with a sledgehammer. When he sits down with the Seattle Times, he gives a fuller version of what he saw that night. In the years after the sinking, Lundy had hoped to keep working for the Fishing Company of Alaska. Instead, in 2009, he was let go. He went home to Texas, and he carried the night of March 23rd with him. What he wanted people to understand was the part about the vents. He had seen the danger before the ship ever left the dock. 2 nights before the sinking, he stood on deck and argued that the netting stacked around the engine room vents was dangerous. If the boat ever flooded, that gear could stop the crew from sealing the vents in time. He was overruled. Then, in the middle of the sinking, it happened exactly the way he feared. The netting was in his way. He could not cover the starboard vent. The sea went down the opening and into the engine room. That flooding, he believes, is part of why the Alaska Ranger went down the way she did. His warning was not about the original hole in the hull. It was about what would happen after water reached the deck. And that is what makes it so hard to shake. Because even if investigators never agree on what opened the Alaska Ranger to the sea, Lundy's warning was about the next failure, the one that turned flooding into something the ship could not contain. He had warned them, and then he spent a decade living with the fact that the warning changed nothing. 42 people came home. 5 did not. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit the thumbs up button and consider hitting subscribe and hitting the bell if you'd like to be notified when we post our next investigation.